Alex stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with practiced precision, his hands moving automatically, even though his mind wasn't fully there. His reflection stared back at him, clean-cut, well-dressed, the face of a man who had everything he ever wanted. Or so it seemed. He was about to marry Sarah, the woman he loved more than anything, the woman who had become the center of his world. Their wedding was just days away, and yet, despite the excitement, despite the dream of a future they had built together, something felt off. He could feel it in his bones, a quiet tension that had been creeping in for weeks now. The room around him was calm, the morning sun casting soft light through the curtains, but within him, a storm was brewing. He had never questioned Sarah's loyalty. Their relationship had always felt perfect, until now. It was as if a crack had appeared in their once flawless bond, one that he couldn't quite see but could feel widening every day. The late nights she spent working late on her laptop, the way she'd get lost in her phone during dinner, the flickers of impatience in her voice when he asked how her day went. It was all so subtle, so easy to brush off, yet his gut told him something was wrong. He tried to shake it off, telling himself that it was just pre-wedding nerves, that the weight of the upcoming commitment was finally starting to sink in. Weddings had a way of doing that to people, didn't they? But it wasn't just nerves. It was a deeper, quieter fear that had settled in his chest, an anxiety he couldn't explain, a feeling of impending doom that he tried to ignore but couldn't quite push away. The thought of confronting Sarah about it lingered at the edge of his mind, but the idea terrified him. What if he was wrong? What if it was just his mind playing tricks on him, creating doubts where none existed? The last thing he wanted was to make her feel like he didn't trust her. Trust was the foundation of their relationship, and if that was broken, what would be left? Everything's fine, he muttered to himself, taking a deep breath and adjusting the knot of his tie for the last time. He needed to calm down, to focus on the positive. Their wedding was almost here. He should be excited, not questioning everything. Yet, the uncertainty gnawed at him, refusing to let go. Sarah had always been his rock. Strong, independent, and so full of life. He remembered when they first met, how easy it was to talk to her. It was a random encounter, a chance meeting at a coffee shop that neither of them had expected to turn into anything. But there was an instant connection. The way she smiled, her laugh that filled up the room, the way she listened when he spoke, as though every word mattered to her. Everything about her drew him in, and over time, he fell in love with her. He thought they were meant to be. But now, as their wedding loomed ahead, a part of him was unsure. The person who had once seemed so transparent, so open, now felt distant, elusive in a way that made his heart ache. Alex shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts that swirled in his mind. He needed to focus on the day ahead. He had an important meeting at work, and he couldn't afford to be distracted. As he left his apartment and stepped into the crisp morning air, the city felt more alive than ever. The streets were bustling with people on their way to work, the hum of traffic in the background, and the chatter of commuters all around. Yet, even among the noise, he felt an overwhelming silence within himself. His mind kept drifting back to Sarah. Was she really happy? Was she still the woman he thought she was? The office was a blur of meetings, emails, and deadlines, a constant stream of distractions that kept him from fully sinking into his thoughts. Yet, there was a part of him that couldn't escape it, the nagging feeling that something was wrong, something he wasn't seeing. The constant back and forth in his head was exhausting. By the time he got home, the unease had only grown. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Sarah had already left for the evening, saying she had a late dinner with some clients. As he hung his coat on the hook by the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. Something she didn't want him to see, something she didn't want him to know. It was almost 10 p.m. when Sarah returned. She looked tired, but not in the way she usually did after a long day. There was something different in her eyes, an unreadable expression that made his stomach churn. She offered him a tight smile as she entered, her eyes darting to her phone as soon as she set her bag down on the counter. "How was your day?" Alex asked, his voice tentative, as if testing the waters. She shrugged, not looking up from her phone. "It was fine. Busy." Same as usual. There was a coldness to her response that didn't sit right with him. He wanted to push further, to ask her what was really going on, but a part of him was afraid of what the answer might be. Instead, he just nodded, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter as he tried to ignore the unease building in his chest. After dinner, they sat in silence on the couch. Sarah, still absorbed in her phone, barely seemed to notice him anymore. Her attention was elsewhere, far from him. He couldn't understand why she seemed so distant, why she was pulling away, and it hurt more than he was willing to admit. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Alex finally asked, his voice quieter than he intended. "You've been distant lately. We're getting married in a few days, and it feels like you're already somewhere else." She froze, her eyes flickering to his for just a moment before quickly looking away. "I'm just tired, Alex. It's nothing." But Alex felt the words in his gut. It was something. He didn't know what it was, but he was determined to find out. That night, as Sarah fell asleep beside him, Alex lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind was racing, filled with images of their life together, their plans for the future, the wedding they had been working toward for so long. He wanted to believe in it all, but the doubt was suffocating. His heart felt heavy with a mixture of fear and confusion. Was he overthinking things? Was he just scared of the commitment? Or was there something more to Sarah's behavior than he wanted to admit? The answer was out of his reach, but he could feel it coming, something he couldn't escape. A storm was brewing, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first crack appeared just a week before the wedding. Alex had woken up early, eager to get through another busy day at work. But there was something in the air that morning. It was like the sky was heavy with anticipation, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. He had spent the previous night tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep, his thoughts constantly drifting back to Sarah and the unsettling emotions he couldn't name. She had been acting distant for days now, and even though he kept telling himself that it was just pre-wedding stress, a deeper part of him felt the weight of her withdrawal. It wasn't like Sarah to be so distant. She was always the one who initiated the small, intimate moments they shared, the one who made him feel special with just a look or a touch. Lately, though, it felt like they were two strangers occupying the same space. That morning, as Alex left for work, Sarah had been sitting at the kitchen table, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the window. He kissed her on the cheek as he grabbed his coat, but she barely reacted, her response a simple "see you later," in a voice that sounded far more distant than it ever had before. He had tried to read her face, searching for any sign of warmth, but all he found was a vague sadness, as though she were waiting for something. Maybe even hoping for something, but he wasn't sure what it was. The thought that she might be having second thoughts about their wedding flickered briefly in his mind, but he pushed it aside. "Stop overthinking, Alex," he told himself. "You're just nervous, that's all. It's normal." But the further he went through the day, the more restless he became. He couldn't focus at work. Every time he sat down for a meeting or answered a phone call, his mind drifted back to Sarah. What was going on? Was he imagining things? Or had their relationship really begun to fall apart? It was a feeling he couldn't shake, and it grew stronger with every passing hour. That evening, when he came home, Sarah wasn't there. Her shoes were neatly placed by the door, her purse still sitting on the counter, but she was nowhere to be found. Alex's stomach clenched. It wasn't like her to be out at this hour without saying something. He checked his phone, but there were no messages from her. Minutes passed, and the gnawing worry turned into something darker, something more primal. He tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. He considered driving to her office, but he didn't want to appear desperate, didn't want to seem like he was checking up on her. Just as he was about to grab a beer from the fridge, the sound of the front door opening interrupted his thoughts. Sarah stepped in, looking exhausted, but she smiled when she saw him, a faint trace of relief in her eyes. "Hey," she said, her voice soft, almost too soft. "I'm sorry I'm late. I got caught up with a client dinner." Alex studied her closely, trying to gauge if there was more to her explanation. Her tone was strained, and there was a nervous energy in the way she moved, as though she were waiting for something. An apology, perhaps, or an excuse that would make things feel normal again. He forced a smile, trying to push away the growing unease. "It's fine. I just didn't expect you to be this late. Everything okay?" "Yeah," she replied quickly, her eyes darting to her phone as she set it down on the counter. "It was just a long dinner. Nothing big. I didn't mean to worry you." But Alex noticed the subtle tension in her voice, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of her phone just a little too long before she put it down. It was small, but it didn't go unnoticed. "I wasn't worried, just curious," he said, walking over to her. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch light, but she stiffened under his fingers. "Sarah?" His voice trailed off, unsure of how to approach the topic that had been weighing on his mind for days. "Are we okay?" She met his gaze for the briefest of moments, then quickly looked away. "Of course," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're fine." The conversation felt hollow. Alex felt like they were speaking different languages, and it bothered him more than he could express. It was as if Sarah had become someone else, someone he didn't fully recognize anymore. It wasn't just the late nights at work or the coldness in her voice. It was her entire demeanor. She was there, but she wasn't really there. That night, they went to bed like they always did, but something between them had shifted. As Sarah drifted off to sleep beside him, Alex lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling him, something she was hiding. The next morning, he woke up early again, his thoughts already heavy with the weight of the conversation they hadn't had the night before. He felt a gnawing need to get to the bottom of things, to confront the elephant in the room. He wasn't sure if it was fear or his own insecurities, but the sense of dread that had been growing in him over the last few days was becoming overwhelming. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that something was about to give way beneath him, but not knowing if he was ready to fall. When he arrived at work, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. He opened it, hoping for some kind of reassurance, some small sign that everything was still fine. "I'll be working late again tonight. Don't wait up." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the first time she'd worked late, but this felt different. It wasn't just the fact that she was staying late. It was the absence of any real explanation. The detached tone of her message, the way she had distanced herself further, made Alex's stomach churn. He felt a flicker of panic rise in his chest. Something was off, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. The day dragged on, each minute stretching longer than the last. Alex tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. What had happened to their connection? What was she hiding from him? He decided that when he got home that evening, he would confront her. He had to. He couldn't keep living with this knot in his stomach, this constant uncertainty about where they stood. He had to know if their future together was real or if he was just fooling himself. But as he stepped off the elevator and into his apartment building, he had no idea just how much his world was about to change. As he turned the key in the lock and opened the door, he was met with an unexpected sight. Sarah's phone was sitting on the counter, screen up, buzzing with a new message. His eyes locked onto the words flashing across the screen. "I can't wait to see you tonight." His heart stopped. The words felt like a knife, sharp and unforgiving. The message was from a man named James, someone Alex had never heard of. Alex stood frozen, staring at the phone, the room spinning around him. The weight of betrayal settled over him like a thick, suffocating fog. He wanted to pick up the phone, to confront her, but his legs felt heavy, as if they were cemented to the floor. The truth had started to reveal itself, and it was nothing like the dream he had built in his mind. Alex spent the next few days in a fog. Every time he looked at Sarah, every touch, every word, felt like a lie. He wanted to confront her, to scream, to demand answers, but fear and doubt held him back. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the truth, to confront the crushing weight of betrayal. One evening, while Sarah was out, Alex stayed home, restless and jittery. He needed to know more, to understand what was happening to their relationship. His mind raced as he thought about the message, about the way she had been acting. Then the unthinkable happened. He heard her voice, muffled but unmistakable, from the hallway. It wasn't her usual tone. It was softer, more intimate. Alex froze. The door to their bedroom was slightly ajar. He hadn't meant to listen, but the words reached him anyway. "James, I can't do this anymore," Sarah said, her voice low. "I love him, but he doesn't know what's been happening. He's too trusting, too good for me." Alex's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He couldn't breathe. He pressed himself against the wall, his mind swirling in disbelief. She loved him. Who was this other man, this James, that she was confessing her love to? The weight of her words hit him like a freight train. Every illusion he had about their perfect relationship shattered in that instant. When Sarah walked through the door, she found Alex standing there, his face pale, his fists clenched at his sides. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know about James." Her face turned ashen, her eyes wide with panic. "Alex, I can explain." "No," he cut her off. "There's nothing to explain. You've already said everything you needed to say." The room felt suffocating. The woman he had planned his future with, the one he had trusted more than anyone else, had betrayed him in the worst way possible. He wanted to scream, to break something, but instead, he felt hollow inside. "I don't want to be with you anymore," he said quietly, each word cutting through the silence. "I can't live in a lie. I can't marry you." Sarah collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "Please," she whispered. "I was confused. I was scared. I love you, I swear." But Alex felt nothing. The emotions that had once bound him to her, love, desire, trust, had turned to ash. There was no coming back from this. He had to let go. The wedding was off. The guests were informed. The venue canceled. The rings returned. It was over. In the weeks that followed, Alex struggled to make sense of everything. How had he missed the signs? How had he allowed himself to be blinded by his love, by his hopes for the future? He poured himself into his work, throwing himself into projects and meetings, trying to drown out the pain. But every night, when the office lights went out and the building emptied, he was left alone with his thoughts. The betrayal haunted him, the image of Sarah with James etched into his mind. But as time passed, Alex began to heal. Slowly, he found clarity. He realized that the pain wasn't just about Sarah's betrayal. It was about his own need for validation, for believing in something perfect when life was far from it. He had loved her deeply, but he had to love himself more. He had to understand that his worth wasn't tied to her approval, her affection. He was enough even without her. In the end, Alex found peace. He learned that love could be beautiful, but it was also fragile, and sometimes you had to walk away from something that no longer served you, no matter how much it hurt. As he sat by the window one evening watching the sunset, he thought about his future. It was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while he felt a flicker of hope. A future without betrayal. A future where he would be whole again. And with that, Alex made a promise to himself. Never again would he let someone else define his happiness.